Welcome to part 2 of our Azure Lab video series here. I hope you guys watched part 1. Even if it wasn't super interesting, it kind of sets us up really well for this next lab. It introduces this concept of how to quickly stand up an Active Directory environment for an Azure lab that you can connect to and do whatever you want for experimentation. It also goes over, I touched a little bit on cost management as far as like how you be aware of what you're going to pay for it, and also kind of demonstrated that it's really cheap to stand up and run these lab environments. However, this video is the one that's going to be more interesting. This is where you take the Microsoft Quickstart template that we used in part 1. I took it offline, I customized it and tweaked it a little bit, and I made it available for you guys to run kind of a much more verbose lab environment out of the gate. Now, this video is going to be using tools that don't just come native with Azure. Whereas in the last one, you click a link, you configure it in Azure, you use RDP to connect to that environment. In this one, it's going to require a couple other things. One, it requires that you have a GitHub account and probably that you're using Git on your computer, so that doesn't require you to install the command line interface for Git. And then also requires it also requires Terraform to be installed in your computer. So I'm not going to get too in depth of how to set that stuff up. I will show you quickly where you can go to install Terraform, but I'm going to just show you what it takes to complete this process once you've got those set up. So the setup process you're going to have to figure out on your own. There's plenty of documentation, so I'll let you guys go with that. If there's a lot of demand for it, I'll go back and work. But let's get started here. So I'm going to open here this GitHub repository. I'll put the link in the description of this video. But this is the repo that I've been slowly building out as I'm doing the AZ801 exam objective videos that I've been doing, the series. And I've got things like the scripts that I use. This is the Active Directory configuration script we used in part 1. It also has scripts for configuring failover clusters and a management server, which I'll get to in a second. Most importantly, this repo has this lab setup directory. This is everything we need to use in order to spin up an Active Directory lab in a customized manner, much easier for you guys. So I'm going to actually sync these repos, or sync this repo locally. Now, if you're not familiar with Git, pay attention to these steps. I'll make it as simple as possible. I'm just going to assume that you are at least in an installed state and walk you through everything else, meaning you have the Git command line interface installed. If you need to do that, you can literally Google install Git, and there's a getting started page. Likewise, for Terraform, when we get to that, if you type in install Terraform, the first page that comes up is directions. And on this page, it's a little bit more complicated. If you use Chocolatey, this is really easy. Otherwise, there's manual install steps right here. You click on Windows if you're using Windows or Mac and Linux, and you should be able to work your way through that. So I'm going to assume this is already done. However, let's go back here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sync this repo locally. Now, you can sync a repo, you can clone it, whatever. I'm just going to show you how I normally do this. So I'm going to copy this path. I'm going to load up, hold on. I've got VS Code here. This is what I use for all of my code configurations or work. Let me just get myself a new terminal menu here. Okay, I am in my C temp directory. This is where I'm going to sync that repo. So I have cloned my repo address. I did that by clicking this code, clone. And then the command to sync this to this directory, you're going to want to be in whatever directory you're working out of. Git clone, and then paste that address. Hit enter. And you'll notice here I've got my kind of Explorer directory here. It syncs, it creates the folder that matches the name of that repo, and here's all my files. So, like I said, I've got my script files for configuring failover clusters. You've got your Active Directory ones, but the lab setup folder is where we're going to be. So I am going to copy the path of this folder of lab setup, and I'm going to use CD. Whoops. CD changes my working directory to be that. So now I'm in this directory, and I can see all of the files that are in here. Right? This is where we need to be. This is how I kick off the installation. Now, I'm going to walk through if you're at this stage, we've synced our files locally, we have them to work on. There are going to be a little bit of tweaks that you have to do before you deploy the environment. So I'm going to walk through these Terraform files, and I realize you might not be familiar with Terraform. The goal here is to give you something that you can download and execute, and then even without being very familiar with Terraform, I'd also like you to be able to tweak this a little bit. So I'm going to walk through these files, what they represent, and maybe you might replay the section when it comes to modifying this if you're trying to do it later. So out of the gate, there's only two things you have to change in this file to get it working. First, you have to set your subscription ID. This is because Terraform needs to know what subscription you're creating resources in. It's also going to require that you have rights to those resources in Azure. The other thing you have to set is the resource group name you're going to use, because obviously you can't create a resource without it being in a resource group. So those are the two details you have to specify. Now if I go to my Azure portal here, I have my lab resource group, and if I go to this resource group, I have all the information I need right here. I can copy the name of this for the first field, so I'll just paste that in. And if I go back, I've got my subscription ID right here. This is at the top of any resource group that you're looking at in Azure. So I'm just going to click the button to copy that. I can paste this here, and that's it. We're off and running. This is as minimal you have to do. But I'm going to walk you through these files really quick, and I'll show you the tweaks that you can make, and then also how you can customize this even further to maybe add servers. If you want to deploy a multi-server setup really quick, you know how to do it. So this first section here, I'm starting in main.tf, because if you use Terraform, all of your main.tf is like the file for controlling everything. But the way Terraform runs, when it executes and deploys resources, it takes any .tf file, combines them into one, and then runs the whole deployment all at once. So separating files like this, I'm just doing this to try and make it more simple for you to understand what is where, or what these resources represent. But realistically, I could do this all in main.tf and it would work the same way. However, starting in main.tf, you've got the two values you put in, and then I also added, you'll recognize from part one, these are all of the variables that you were able to customize when you are deploying that Quickstart template in your Azure tenant. So this location is the Azure region, the Azure location you're deploying to. You got your resource group name. This leave as is unless you're going to fork the repo and do your own customization. That takes a more advanced level of knowledge, but you're welcome to do it. However, if you aren't familiar with that, just leave that as is. Otherwise, all of these need to be modified. So this is your domain name. Remember in the example I used contoso.local. This is the same domain name in distinguished name format. So you're going to want to modify these. For my deployment here in the demo, I usually use dzab.local. Here I'm just going to use contoso.com because that's kind of like a generic name. So I'm going to set my two variables for that. Oh, contoso.com, that's how DN format. Alright, for these are information about the domain controller you're spinning up. This is all based on that same Quickstart template. I've just taken it and tweaked it a little bit. So you've got the name of your domain controller. I'm going to leave this as ADP1. The IP of your domain controller and the size. Next, you've got your domain admin credentials. This is the username and password that you are going to use to create your original user in your lab environment. I'm going to set this to dzabinski.-da. And then this password isn't just used for this user. I also take this password and use it to create the password for all the users in the environment. Because remember, this is a lab environment. I set all the passwords to the exact same thing so I can switch between user context easily. And next, you've got the network information for Azure. So this is my VNet. This is the subnet within the VNet that the AD is going to be on. And really, that's about it. So you'll notice the only two things I tweaked here, I set my username, I set my domain name and DN, and then I'd set the resource group and subscription ID. I'm off and running. However, just to run through what's getting created here, all these resource blocks are resources in Azure that are being created. Data is just, it's calling and getting that data before it runs so that you can do things dynamically. In this case, this is getting the public IP address of the computer that you are using to deploy these resources, and I use this to create an NSG rule to allow RDP from the public IP. So what I'm doing here is essentially get your public IP address and make a rule in Azure so that you are allowed to RDP into that resource. You might need to tweak that if you're trying to access it from a different location than where you're doing the deployment. But I've got my public IP that it's creating. You're creating the NSG. This is that RDP rule I just specified, and you'll notice it's using the public IP address that it's got. And then finally, this is associating the NSG that we're creating here to allow RDP with the network interface on our management VM. Now, something that's a little bit different about this deployment than the Quickstart template from Microsoft is I'm not just deploying one DC. I'm deploying a domain controller, and then I'm deploying a second management server. And this is because generally best practice, especially for the AZ-801 exams, they want you using like a central management server either for your Windows Admin Center console or for your server manager, and really you should be connecting to that instead of a DC anyway. So I like to emulate that by spinning up a separate management server that I can then install tools and stuff on for management, and that's what this is getting stood up. Or that's what this is doing. It's associating NSG with the NIC on that server. Now, if I go over here, so I'm looking at my ad.tf file, these are all of the resources to create and deploy that Quickstart template. Now, I have a bunch of stuff commented out because I've done my own tweaking, but this is basically deploying the template, and this is just getting the subnet information that's created from that template. Last file I'll show you is servers. This is the Terraform file that's actually deploying servers. So the reason I have this separated is you can tweak this to create more servers when you're deploying it. What I'll do later is I'll come and add one, but out of the box only one server is being created, and these are the details for it. It's going to be my management P1 server. I have the server size, the OS version. I'm adding an extra data disk to it that's 40 gigs, and then I assign it a public IP address. I also have it specified to link the public IP we're creating, and it sets it to be in a separate server subnet. Now that is one thing that's unique about this is it does create a second subnet. This is 10.0.1 instead of 10.0.0 where our domain controller is on. I did that just so I can kind of emulate network rules or crossing subnets if I needed to. And then finally, this is creating however many servers you have specified in this resource right here. In this case, I have one. I commented out a second one in case you want to uncomment and create that second server. This also gives you a block that you can use to kind of tweak and create it, but that's all. So let's pause here and review really quickly what we're creating. We've synced to GitHub repository. I have a modified copy of the Microsoft template that is in that repo that you're going to use to create it. You are going to run a Terraform deployment, and in that Terraform deployment you are creating the domain controller. It's going to have Active Directory installed on it. It's going to have the properties that you specified, that you modified in the Terraform files. That's your username, your password, your domain name. And then with that you are getting a second management server. That's going to be the server that you connect to in Azure, and then once you're RDP'd into that server, you can RDP laterally into your domain controller or other servers you create. And so you're getting a domain controller, a second server, and then you also have the option of adding more servers as well once it's created. So with all that being said, let's kick off this Terraform deployment and see how it works. So I'm going to go back to my desk cam here, and I'm going to walk you through these commands as needed. Now, like I said, I'm assuming you have Terraform installed already, and you can confirm that by going Terraform help, and if you see a help response here, it means Terraform's installed. So the first step to deploy this, you have to be in the directory with your main.tf file. So you'll notice this is in temp AZ-801 lab setup, and that is the directory I'm in down here. So I'm going to first command, just type in Terraform init. That initializes Terraform by saying, okay, go and download any sort of providers you need to in order to deploy these resources. In this case, the only provider, well, the providers I need are the Azure provider, and there's a couple other ones that are linked in this for the server template that it's using, but you don't have to worry about this. All you have to do is type Terraform init. You will get a message saying it's been successful. Next thing, this isn't required, but this is best practice for Terraform. I'm going to type Terraform plan. What this is going to do is it reads all of your files, and it will print out a report of what resources are actually going to be created or changed. In this case, we don't have any resources created, so this should just list, these are all the resources I'm going to add. It's going to take a couple seconds to read the data here, but it'll give us a plan. And right here, it's showing I'm going to add 12 resources, and if I scroll up, I can see the different things it's creating. So this is for the server, This is also for that server. You'll notice it's got a bunch of sub resources there. It's creating a subnet. This is going to be the deployment. This is the Active Directory deployment that it's doing to deploy the domain controller and your Active Directory domain. It's got all these values printed out here. Then you've got your public IP and your NSG rules. So all that looks good. You're probably going to see exactly the same thing when you do this. The last step we have to do here is type Terraform apply. Terraform apply is what actually creates the resources. So if you get to this step, once we hit this command, it's going to reach out to that Azure subscription that you specified in main.tf at the top right here. It's going to create the resources in this subscription and this resource group. This is also dependent on you having permissions in Azure to create these resources. If you don't, it's not going to work. Also, you might need AZ CLI installed so you can do an AZ login the first time so that it can prompt and log in on your behalf so that it's specified what user you're using. That I didn't list that in the beginning, but that might be required. Either way, I'm going to hit Terraform apply. It gave me this error message that I'm going to ignore because it's not a big deal. But it's going to start doing the same steps that it did to generate the plan. And it will prompt us with the same output. You'll see here's the same plan steps above, and then it's going to say, do you want to perform these actions? Type in yes to go. So I'm going to type yes, hit enter, and we're off to the races. It's going to start creating the resources. It will demonstrate. Hold on. I did this once before, and when it did the destroy, apparently it didn't destroy this resource because it specifies the name of the deployment template here. This has to be deleted, otherwise it gets that conflict because it can't create a template with the same name. And I didn't want to go through the process of creating a random value every time. So, yes, I could just customize the date on here, I guess, but that's fine. Maybe I'll tweak that either way. If you run into this error, I'm in the resource group that I'm deploying the resources in. I'll go to deployments. And you'll see in the past that deploy domain template here, just check the box and delete it, and once that's successful, we'll be good to go. So now I've done that, I'm going to rerun this, and rather than getting prompted and have to say yes again, I'm just going to type in auto approve. That's a parameter that allows you to just kick off the deployment if you know it's going to be good, and you know you're going to improve it. And this is one last resource because it was able to deploy the public IP address before it kicked off that template deployment. So this is creating. Now, if you remember back from the part 1 video, this deployment takes about 15 to 20 minutes to deploy. I think on average it's like 17 minutes. And that's because it has to create the domain controller, and then after the domain controller is created, it runs a script to configure the domain. What I've done here, and what you can look at if you'd like, is I have customized the DSC configuration that installs and creates Active Directory domain, and I've customized it to set up the domain automatically for me. Because if you remember back to that part 1 template, after you stand up your domain controller, you still have to connect, and I had a script that you run to configure the domain. You don't have to run that script anymore. Now everything is set up for you. If I look under this lab setup folder and go to deploy and DSC, right here is the DSC configuration I'm using after the domain controller has been stood up. Now ignore any errors here, it doesn't actually know what it's talking about, but you'll see these elements in here match exactly what I've got in that script. So it specifies the OU it wants created, those sub OUs, the users that are created out of the box, my admin users, including the domain admin ones. It creates groups. All of those are passed into this DSC configuration, and it reads that DSC after the domain controller VM has been created and configures everything according to what you have set here. If you are comfortable with PowerShell and you're relatively familiar with DSC, you can customize this. I would fork the repo, just change these files. If you do make changes to this PowerShell file, you do have to add it to the zip file. And then the next thing you have to do is, once these are read, you have to go to, let's see, this is the DSC content location. It's showing Azure deploy.json. So if I go to this file, this is going to reference the DSC configuration. Let's let's see, this is extension DSC right here. So this is saying, oops, from the location of this file under DSC create ADPDC right here, these are the files you're reading. So if you're going to change DSC, what you have to do is fork this, keep all of these files together, everything that's in this deploy folder, and then reference the public location of those files here. This is referencing my GitHub repository under lab setup deploy, and then it directly references this folder or this file. You need all of them. You can fork this and update this to be your repo. The only requirement is it needs to be able to access the repo. So if you're customizing this, it has to be public facing. At least the DSC configuration portion does. It might be possible to customize that further, but I'm not going to get into it. Either way, this deployment you'll see down here is running for 3 minutes. This is going to take 17 to 20 minutes, somewhere around that to deploy, because it does have to do that Active Directory configuration after the fact. I'm going to pause the video here, and we will come back to once the resources are deployed. Okay, we can see that our Terraform deployment here is finished. It's showing that everything was created successfully, and the last thing that Terraform is configured to do is it spits out, once the deployment is complete, the public IP address that was created for you so that you know what you can use to connect. So I've got this right here. Let me copy this and let's go ahead and connect here to our environment. So I'm going to paste that here, and notice, or just a reminder, I've got my username right there, and I've got my domain name right there. So let's connect. Let's do Contoso.com. That's the domain name. / my admin username that I created. Oops. And the password. And right there, it looks like it's connecting to my management P1 server. It's joined the Contoso domain. So let's connect to that and give it a bit here. Let's switch over to the RDP window. So what we'll do here is I'm going to show you what was created. I'm going to show you how it's a little bit different. It's really not that much different than the Quickstart template from part 1. And then after we've looked at this, I'm going to run through two things. I'm going to, one, we'll look at the Azure portal and see the resource that created there. It's going to be the same thing that was in our template. I've also mentioned how to modify the NSG rules, which are basically the firewall rules that only allow RDP from your location. And then we're going to add a second server in the Terraform deployment and redeploy that so you can see how that works. And then we'll wrap up by showing just how easy it is to destroy resources once we're done, which is kind of the advantage of Terraform. Easy to deploy, easy to destroy. This window is taking a long time to connect. So there we go. Doesn't normally take this long, but I don't know. Just might be a performance issue. Could be my internet. Who knows? Okay, this is loading. Now, like I said, we're connecting into the management server. So let me quick switch back here. The first thing that I always do with my management server, this isn't automated, but I have this script here that I use to configure it. All the script is doing is setting it to the time zone and installing all the different RSAT tools that I might use in the lab environment. It just loops through this list and installs them all. So I'm going to copy this just so I can run that when we first connect, because that's, go back to my RDP window here. This is still black. What's doing? Oh, it's loading. Okay. It's taking a really long time to get up and running. Now, like I said, management server. So by default, nothing's going to be installed on this, but you already have your Active Directory domain stood up and working. So it also sets your DNS server primarily to be that domain controller. It's going to take a little while to load here. While this is loading, rather than run that script first, I'm going to try and RDP into the domain controller before the script, because the script takes a while to run. All it does is install those RSAT tools, and all I'm doing here is demoing what you get out of the box. So let's do RDP. The way this is configured, the idea behind this, as a reminder, you connect to the management server. Once you're in the management server, you can connect to any other servers that you're standing up with your deployment. So my domain controller's name is ADP1. I'm going to connect, and the fact that we could use the name is because we have DNS correctly configured. It's going to prompt me for my password again. And here we are, RDPing laterally once we're in Azure to our domain controller. Just take a note here. Man, it's taking a while to come up. Okay. Let's go to Active Directory. Oh, I hate slow servers. Cool. And 80 is up. You see, this is the domain that we specified. And you'll notice, rather than just our basic users and computers OU, I have groups with my sub OUs and groups already populated. I have people with demo users also populated. They've got their admin and DA accounts there. I've got my resources for like service accounts if you want to stand up any of those, and you've got an OU for servers, which is going to be where any of your new servers you deploy are going to be placed automatically. Obviously, domain controllers is in the domain controllers OU. So out of the box, I didn't have to run any sort of post configuration script on AD after it stood up. Active Directory was installed. The OUs and users were configured. Servers can now be joined via Terraform. You don't have to do any sort of domain joining. You now have a lab environment with extra servers ready to go. That's the advantage of doing it this way, is I've got custom deployments. You can use GitHub and Terraform to deploy. You get resources and you can modify them very quickly out of the box. And to demonstrate that, let's switch back to Terraform and I'll show you how you can quickly add another server. So throughout my AZ801 series, I ran into multiple scenarios where I needed multiple servers. Like, for example, when I was doing failover clusters in Azure. Not recommended, by the way. If I want to go back and add an extra server, so I have another server in my lab to work with, I'm going to go to my servers.tf file. Now, this is back in the Terraform directory that we synced earlier. And what I want to look at is under this locals block, which is local variables. This is my servers variable, and everything in the servers variable is getting created and turned into a server. Right now, I only have one entry. It's this management P1 server. But you'll notice I have commented out a second block here. So if I uncomment this, I also need to uncomment this to add a comma there. I now have a second server that I'm going to set up. Now, there's a couple of things you're going to need. You should be able to just run this as is and it will work, but I want to point out the different customizations you can make. You can specify a different subnet. If you want to create another subnet and link it to that, you need to know the subnet ID in order for that to work. Otherwise, this is going to be the server's subnet, which is the same thing this one's on. Don't specify public IP. Leave that null because unless you know how to create a public IP and assign it, there's no reason to do that. We use the public IP to connect to the management server, and then the management server can RDP sideways into this. You do specify a private IP. This IP has to be in the same subnet that you specified here. And then you can also change the OU if you'd like. Otherwise, this is going to get dropped in your server's OU when it's created. The last thing you can do is if you need multiple data disks, you have the ability to add them here. If you don't need an additional data disk, leave this blank. It'll get stood up with your OS disk. Otherwise, if I expand this server right here, you can see I have one disk that's being added. Essentially, each one of these objects is a disk. So you might need to add a couple of them if you want to add multiple disks. Otherwise, you can copy and paste this and you see the stats you need to add here. So if I wanted to add a disk, I could copy, paste it in here. If I want multiple, I can comma paste a second one, and then you need to name the disk, disk 2, disk 3, specify the size, and really that's about it. You can customize these other options if you want, otherwise I can leave those blank. In this case, I don't want another data disk, so I'm just going to clear out this field, and that should be enough. So I've added, out of the box, this has my one server, right? Management P1. What I'm doing is adding a second one. If I've added this and I want to deploy it, I can do the exact same command I did last time, which is Terraform apply, and that will check to see if there's anything added, in this case a second server, and deploy it. If I want to double check that I did everything right, that I added that custom box and everything's happy, I can type in Terraform validate, and that'll just run through your configuration and make sure everything is valid. In this case, yep, we're good to go. So I've uncommented. Let me go ahead and deploy the second server, and we can see how quickly this works. So I'm adding my auto approve flag. If I didn't do that, I'd just have to type yes after the plan is generated. In this case, I know it's going to create a second server. I'm fine with it. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And we are going to reread all stuff. It's telling me it's going to change a couple things. It's going to destroy something. I'm not sure what that is. Oh, it's just tweaking a couple things. All right, but this should go ahead and create that second server for us. So while this is running, I just want to mention one thing. I do have my post configuration steps. The first time I've done any of these lab setups is I do go and configure run the script on the management server to install RSet. Sorry, I ran into an error there. It was trying to dynamically look up the server name. Anyways, shouldn't matter. I tweaked some stuff. You guys shouldn't run into the same issue. Plus, normally if you're deploying this, you're not adding servers after the fact, but you might run into this issue. Either way, if I do Terraform plan, we should work now. It's going to read. Yep. And it will show us, there we go, 5 to add. This is going to try and add that server again. So let's do this one more time. I might try and do some more troubleshooting on that. If you run into the issue, feel free to open an issue in my GitHub repo. Otherwise, it shouldn't really be a problem. The reason that came up is I have to link the NSG we create to allow RDP to a network interface, and I was doing it by name because my management server was always named Management P1. However, I modified this a little bit, this block right here, so rather than being stuck and mapped to a name statically, I just mapped it to the very first server that's being created here. In this case, it is Management P1, but it tried to refresh the state, and it wasn't sure what network interface it was supposed to be linked to, so it gave me an error. I'm not really sure how to deal with that unless I would either make this, you have to set this with that name. Otherwise, I'm trying to make this dynamic and workable, so if you were to change things, it would still work, but oh well, came up. Either way, I did a couple of tweaking. Maybe I'll look back at that. That really shouldn't be an issue you've run into, but it might be. We can see here, we've got our Windows VM. It's created. It's creating this second one, the back.p1 server that we've added here. And after it's creating it, this is another really cool thing about doing this through Terraform is it's creating it and it automatically joins it to the domain that you specified in your template. So you can see that it's got the join domain step. This does take a little while. It can take about 3 minutes because it has to join the domain, then restart the server and come back online. But once we're online, we now have a third server that we can work with. We've got our management server, our domain controller, and now this back-p1 server that we can do whatever we want. And that's really the end of this demo. So this is going to be happening. Let's cut back over to RDP, and if I refresh this, the back P1 server is already joined to the domain. It's probably restarting. It's going to be a little while before I connect to it. But then for my management server, if I do command line ping, oops, back P1, it's got my IP address there that I specified. It's not going to return yet because it hasn't restarted, but I just saw that the deployment is finished. So after that's deployed, I should be able to try and open a second RDP connection. It's not letting me. new server. There we go. So what we got here then is our server setup. You've got the ability to customize which servers are automatically added to your domain. You have a very functional, small lab environment that's running in Azure that you can spin up, do whatever you want, configure whatever you want in any of the servers. The Windows licenses are baked into the cost of the VM, so you don't have to pay for an additional Windows license. You've got a lab environment that you can do whatever you want with and customize it anyway. I believe the changes I made to that Quickstart template with the ability to deploy it with Terraform adds a lot of extensibility and allows a lot of flexibility for you to customize this lab environment for anything you could possibly want to test out. It's a little bit slow because we're using small VM images, but that also makes it really cheap. Like I said in, I think, the part 1 video, it costs me $3 or $4 to run about 4 servers for about 6 to 8 hours a day if I was doing really heavy stuff. Otherwise, if I was doing just light lab work and working through things, it was only costing me $1.50 to run labs. It's very inexpensive, and that's what I wanted to show. Now, the last step of this, obviously, we were going to show the Azure portal, so let's do that now. Go here, portal, refresh. Here you've got all your server resources. So I got my domain controller, the new back server we added, our management server. More importantly, we've got our public IP address. This is what we connect to, and this is the NSG. Now, this NSG you might need to do some tweaking on. I have a rule added. It blocks any outbound connections because we don't want to just allow anybody to connect to this lab environment. But this specifies the source. The source is the one thing you might need to change. Now, you can't modify an NSG rule after you've been created. There's no option to, so you can delete this over here. I can see right at the edge of my cam there's delete option, or rather than deleting, this IP address that is specified should be the IP address of the workstation that you use to deploy Terraform. It's written that way to assume that you're going to be connecting from the same workstation you're deploying from. You can just, if you need to, go to inbound security rules and add a second RDP rule, and the way we do that is, let me hide my camera really quick here. Hide. Literally, source. Set the source to an IP address, whatever public IP address that you want to use. So, let's say you wanted to be working for a second location that had this IP. Add that, and then for destination, choose RDP and hit allow. Allow from second location. And that's as simple as this. And now I'm allowed to RDP from this IP or this IP. So you have the ability to customize these rules, but this is the only thing that might prevent you from connecting, because if the IP for whatever reason is different, like I was spinning this up from home and I was doing classwork from the school I teach at, I had to add that IP address as well to mine. So there you go. Otherwise, all of your resources are here. Now, this is where we get to the cool part. Well, another cool part. After I've been working on this, let's say I've spun these servers up, I've done a whole bunch of tweaking, I am now ready to wind down for the day. There's a really easy way to do that. Go back to Terraform, and in one command, Terraform destroy. It will take everything that you've created with Terraform, so the 2 servers, management and back P1, your domain controller, your template that you used to deploy it, everything you've created, it will now go out and destroy that thing. Easy as can be. So it lists everything it's going to destroy, in this case 16 resources, and it prompts me, do I want to destroy it? Yes. And it goes through and deletes it. And what does that do? That saves you having to pay for it. So now I've literally spun up servers quickly. I have a working lab environment, I can do everything, and then when I'm done, I hit one command and everything is deleted, and now I'm not paying for anything else. It doesn't get any easier. So that's the demo of part 2 here for spinning up Instant Lab. If I left anything out or skimmed over things too quickly, feel free to leave me a comment and I will reply. I have a feeling I did. Because if you're not familiar with this stuff, it can be really intimidating. I'm hoping you can just follow along and deploy it. I will also be updating instructions that are on the GitHub repo itself. So if you need like text reference of how to set this up, there will be instructions there as well. It'll be under the README page. So if I switch back here. I have to customize the README here, but if you want to lab setup, I'm going to add instructions here on how to deploy the domain. So it's all going to be in the same repo. Finally, yeah, leave me a comment on YouTube if you want. You can open issues on this page right here if there's something else that didn't work or an error that you ran into, and I will work through those or help you work through those. And the last thing that I was going to show, which is really cool, is if I go back to the repo that I was using to, this is basically a copy of the same repo that I was doing some tweak that I was deploying the lab resources. It's private. I'm not going to share it out because there's some stuff in here that I don't want to share. The last thing that I did to customize this is I don't know if you're familiar with Terraform or with GitHub Actions, but I have workflows that run these for me. So rather than needing to download and run my Terraform deployments from my local computer, I can literally go here to Terraform Apply, click this button to run workflow. Let me make this a little bit bigger. This button over here to run workflow, and it will go and run those commands for me on a container that's spun up by GitHub, create all my resources so that I don't even have to be here. I don't have to have a computer open. I can pull this up while I'm on my phone or at work, run the workflow, and by the time I get to some place that I need to work from, all the resources will be created for me. On the flip side, I have my destroy workflow running here. So I can click this button, it goes and destroys all the resources. I also have this set to run every day at like 11 p.m. So if I forget to blow away my lab resources, it will destroy all those for me. And I can disable this if I don't want to run it, but that keeps me from accidentally having resources that are continuing to run that I'm paying for. Lastly, I have a stop and start VM function. So if I want to not pay for stuff, like when I was doing my cluster lab environment, I was honestly wanted to leave that for a couple days, so I disabled my destroy workflow. I didn't want to lose where I was at, but I'm running 4 VMs and I don't want to pay for them. So I'd come over here, I'd run my stop action, and this would go to Terraform and stop all the VMs I have running, so I'm not paying for them. And then when I'm ready to keep working again, I come back over here and run start VMs instead. This is really cool, and this is where you get into some more of the advanced CI/CD type GitHub based automation stuff where you don't even need to be here, it runs it for you. But this is much more advanced, and I didn't really want to get into all the topics of what was required for this, other than to say this is where you can eventually get to where you have a lot of flexibility in how you're spinning things up and creating them. With that being said, that's my tutorial for the AZ or the Instant Active Directory lab and how you can customize it and get it working. I've still got here my resources being destroyed, but that's just going to take a couple minutes. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope that you guys can get a lot of value out of this. The ability to create your own resources is super huge when it comes to studying things, because especially if you're not worried about breaking a lab environment, going through the process of creating them and getting first-hand experience on the things you're trying to learn makes all the difference in the world and makes passing those certification exams a million times easier. I just got kicked off my RDP sessions because the VM's destroyed. So there we go. With that, I think that's a good exit. I will see you guys later. Please hit like or subscribe. It's good for me to know that people are getting value out of these content. Appreciate it.